Hi, Michael. How are you?
I'm fine, my dear. How are you?
I am wonderful.
Yes.
Today we're going to talk about chapters 10 through 15 of Razzle Dazzle. So much happens in these chapters, but the main topics that we'll cover today are the rise of Michael Bennett and him bringing a chorus line to Broadway, the introduction of the Nederlanders into your book, and the cleanup of Times Square and New York in general in the 70s. So let's start with Michael Bennett. What was the process for you of researching his journey and bringing a chorus line to Broadway? Where did you begin? What was that like to learn about that?
The key person on that was John Brelio, famous theatrical lawyer, now retired. And I knew John very, very well. So I told him about the book I was going to write about Michael Bennett. And over a series of long interviews with John in his fabulous Fifth Avenue apartment, I must say, John began to really open up about his relationship with Michael Bennett. And you have to understand about Michael Bennett, he came from a totally, can I use a curse word on this thing?
Sure.
Michael Bennett came up from a totally fucked up family, okay? So he's this little kid growing up in Buffalo. His dad is a low-level mobster. And his dad used to bring mobsters to his house. And Michael would tap dance for them. And his dad would say to the mobsters, look at what my son can do. Is there any kind of deal we can do if I get him to perform? Can I get a piece of the action? So Michael was being prostituted out by his father to the mob when he was 10 years old. So think about that. Scars you for life, right? And so Michael Bennett realizes, I have to get out of this house. I have to leave this place. I can't deal with my dad. Also, remember, he's gay. You know, gay back in the 1950s when you couldn't. Right. And his dad is an Italian guy. His mom doesn't understand who he is. And he thinks, I have to get out of here. So what does he do? One day he says, and he loves musical theater because he saw the movie West Side Story. And he would dance. And I have a video that John Brello sent me of Michael Bennett as a young man doing all of the West Side Story dances in his driveway when he was 10 years old.
You have that video?
I have that video, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Gave it to me. Yeah. It's amazing to see this little kid just doing all of the Jerome Robbins choreography in his Buffalo driveway.
Yeah.
So Michael says, I got to get out of here. This is not the world that I want to be in. So one day he goes to his high school and he slams his locker shut and he says, I'm leaving. And he went to New York. He just ran away from a family that had abused him and scarred him. Comes to New York and he's a talented kid. You know, he's dancing all the West Side Story, all the Jerome Robbins choreography in his driveway. Comes here, gets cast in a tour of West Side Story in Europe. And there he goes. And then he begins to meet all of these people. Becomes a dancer on Broadway. He was in Hubaloo with Donna McKechnie, and she became his sister and his wife, and that was very weird, but you know, that's how things worked back in those days.
Right.
But he begins to learn the rudiments of Broadway as a kid in the chorus, but he's ambitious. He doesn't want to be the kid in the chorus for too long. So he begins to look around and study. Oh, this director is good. This choreographer is okay. I can do a little bit better than that. And I remember Donna McKechnie telling me when they were dancing in, I think it was called Hubaloo on TV, they were in the midst of things going, oh, and Michael Bennett said, I'm going to be a choreographer one day. Which is okay, right? And then I'm going to be a director. And they were like, you know, doing the dance right there. He knew from the beginning what he wanted to do. I remember talking to Tommy Tune, the great Tommy Tune, who's still with us, thank God. He's the last remnant of the past. And Tommy met Michael. I think this is in the book. They were on the elevator at some old rehearsal studio, and Michael looked up and saw Tommy and said, you know, you're really tall. And Tommy said, you're really short. And Tommy said, and Tommy was going to like some other show, and Michael said, well, come to our show. And Michael said, okay. So we went with Tommy Toon. I think it was A Joyful Noise that Michael was choreographing.
Yeah.
Tommy went in there, and I remember Tommy telling me that Michael was doing steps that no one had ever done before, stuff that was going on. And one of the dancers said, stick with us. We're going to go places. And Tommy cast his lot with Michael Bennett. And I remember Tommy telling me this. He said, I'd never seen anybody like this guy. He was short, wasn't very attractive, but he had energy and charisma and drive. And Tommy said, when we were both poor, he remembered singing at a diner, long gone, and Michael Bennett had achieved nothing at this point. But Michael sat with Tommy and said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to control everything. We're going to control the directors, the choreographers. We're going to build a building, and the producers will come to us, and we will tell them who's going to direct this show, who's going to choreograph that show. And Tommy said to me, Michael Bennett had the whole thing in his mind when he was just a little kid trying to do some dances. He conceived of himself as a mogul before the term was a mogul. He just knew what he wanted to do.
That's wild. That ambition is amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, some people have that and they just know.
Most people don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. I, of course, had it because, I'm a brilliant book writer and columnist and broadcaster. So, yes.
Of course.
See it that way as well. But, that's the thing. It's like I always say about Broadway, the thing on Broadway is, who told me this? God, I remember. Hal Prince. Hal Prince told me this. And I think it holds true for so many things. Hal Prince once said to me, I used to go over to his office at Rockefeller Center and just stick around and, yak away. And Hal said to me, Michael, if you want to be in the theater, you can't give people what they want. You have to give them something they couldn't even have imagined. And that's when theater begins. And Michael Bennett gave people things that they could not have imagined. A chorus line, for example.
Right.
Back then, you had to have stars in a Broadway show, and Broadway was kind of faltering. And Michael Bennett comes up with this idea. All right, what about the people who dance behind the star? What about those non-entities whose names you vaguely read in the playbill, but you'll never see again? What about those people? What about those people who I once was, dancing behind the star, just doing the moves? What about those people? What are their lives like? What are hopes and dreams? Excuse me. And, he got together with some of his old dancer friends, turned on a tape recorder. They drank a lot of wine, trust me, I know, because I talked to a lot of people who were there. And he said, tell me about your life. And I have John Brelio, who's Michael's lawyer. John Brelio gave me the tapes of those first encounters. And the very first thing Michael Bennett says on the tapes is, I don't know what this is going to be. It could be a movie. It could be a TV show. It could be a Broadway show. I just want to hear what you guys have to say about your lives. And they poured everything out. And then through the help of Marvin Hamlish and Ed Kleben, they began to shape the show into what we now know as a chorus line.
It's incredible.
Huh?
And it changed the face of Broadway. I mean, Broadway was struggling really badly. And that show almost single-handedly upped the money coming in to Broadway at that time.
Well, the Schuberts, run by Bernie Jacobs and Jerry Schoenfeld, they were really struggling then. Well, they had a couple of hits, Equus and Pippin, I think. But, they were not massive hits. And Bernie Jacobs, I think I may have said this in the last conversation, the way Bernie Jacobs met Michael Bennett was, Michael Bennett directed Coco, or took over the direction of Coco. And they met at a party, and Bernie said, curious, how do you control Katharine Hepburn? And Michael said, well, if she wants to go right, I tell her to go left. He just figured out how to control people. And Bernie Jacobs, who also was controlling people, remember this, He's trying to build this empire, so he has to control people too.
Right.
He found a fellow guy who also knew how to control people. And that was the bond that brought them together. And Michael came to love Bernie, and Bernie loved Michael as his son, his surrogate son, because, kids he loved, but they were not like Michael Bennett with that kind of charging up. And so Michael Bennett was doing a chorus line down at the Public Theater with Joe Papp. And Joe had run out of money. And the show was still a work in progress.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Joe said to Michael, I'm sorry, we don't have any money. It's done. It's over. So then Michael says to Marvin Hamlet, he says, we got to get some money. So we have to go see Bernie at the Schubert organization. Got to go. So they get in the car together. Taxi cab, I think. They go up and Michael says to Marvin, don't play the sad songs. Bernie does not like sad. Don't play Kiss Today, Goodbye. Got to do the tits and ass numbers. That's what Bernie would be interested in. So they arrive at the Schubert organization, which is now like a fancy place. But back then it was not so fancy,
Mm-hmm.
Piano. I remember Marvin telling me this. The piano that he had to play tits and ass on had not been opened since Sigmund Romberg was the in-house composer for the Schubert brothers back in 1920.
Oh my gosh.
So Marvin opens the piano to play tits and ass, and he hits the first note, and the leg of the piano collapsed and fell down.
Right.
Bernie Jacobs and his pal Phil Smith, just retired from the Schubert, they're scrambling to hold the piano up. Well, Marvin finishes tits and ass, right? And Marvin told me, so I'm thinking, these are the people who run Broadway? Are you kidding me? I'm a Hollywood composer. What have I gotten myself into?
Right.
So Marvin plays a few songs, and Bernie brings Michael back into his office. And I've been in that office. That Bernie's office used to be J.J. Schubert's, Lee Schubert's dining room back in the day.
Right.
The Schuberts lived above all the theaters that they had.
Mm-hmm.
So Michael says, look, Joe Papp has run out of money. You can have my show. Take my show. Chorus line, take it. Bernie, very smart guy, says, you know what? I can't do that to Joe. I can't steal a show away from Joe. And Michael was crestfallen. And he said, well, but it's going to die if you don't take it. And Bernie said, you don't understand. Joe Papp is doing a lot of interesting things down at the Public Theater. And I can't alienate him by stealing the show. Because we need to fill theaters. And Joe's doing a lot of stuff. Some of the stuff might be good that we can bring up here. What I can do is, the Schuberts, we can scrape together enough money. We can lend Joe the money to finish the show down at the Public. And we will see what happens. So the Schuberts gave a loan to Joe Papp to allow him to finish Michael Bennett's chorus line down there. And from the very first performance, I mean, it's like it was the Hamilton of its day.
Right.
Everything got around the city. This is the most exciting thing you have ever seen. And they all went down there. Everybody went down there. John Brelio told me, Michael Bennett's lawyer, he told me, people were, Diana Ross was sitting on the stairs. Barbara Streisand couldn't get a seat, so she would sit on the stairs to see a chorus line.
Wow.
But here's the shrewd thing about Bernie Jacobs. Okay, we lent you guys the money. Now where are you going to go? You're going to go to the Schubert Theater, which we own. And a chorus line ran. Phil Smith told me he thought that it would run 5 years. It ran 15 years.
Yeah.
And the amount of money the Schuberts earned, not only from the rent on that theater, but from the concessions, and then they produced it with Joe Papp around the country. That was the show that turned everything around.
Yeah. That's truly incredible. I mean, it changed everything at that time in the theater world. Let's jump ship for 1 second and talk about the Nederlanders, because you sort of you talk about them in the beginning of the book, but they sort of get their introduction in these few chapters. Could you just give me, a summary, if you will, on how the Nederlanders came to be competition for the Schubert organization?
Well, then Jimmy Nederlander Sr., a dear friend of mine, dear friend of mine, he came out of Detroit. His father, DT, who was in the, I can't remember, I think it was the garment business or something, but, he had some money, so he bought some theaters in Detroit. This is, we're talking like the 10s, 1920s.
Mm-hmm.
So Jimmy grew up with his dad owning theaters in Detroit. And Jimmy's job was to go to New York to scout out new shows that could play Detroit. Because once upon a time, there was a hit Broadway show, then you would want to book it for your theater in Detroit.
Mm-hmm.
So Jimmy was going to New York a lot. And one day he's walking through Times Square with a friend of his, and they're walking by the Palace Theater, which was owned by RKO.
Mm-hmm.
And his friend says to him, Jimmy, RKO wants to unload the Palace. You should buy it. So Jimmy says, and this is how he talked. He said, well, where do I meet the guy? Well, he's, in the Paramount building. That's where RKO's headquarters are. So Jimmy goes up and he makes a handshake deal to buy the Palace Theater in 1964, I think it was, for about $150,000. Jimmy goes back to Detroit, talks to his dad. His dad said, yeah, I'll take it. Jimmy talks to the automobile executives who were there in Detroit who's taken too. And so Jimmy buys the Palace Theater for $150,000. Now, the key thing to understand about Jimmy Nederlander Sr. is that the Schuberts could not buy any more theaters in New York because there was an antitrust suit brought against them that prevented them from buying any more theaters in New York. So they had their theaters, their 17 theaters, but there were a bunch of other theaters that were out there owned by, banks and little old ladies and a couple of guys who were in jail, who owned the Alvin Theater, and they both went to jail because of fraud. They sold land in Florida that did not exist. So Jimmy owns the Palace, and he looks around and says, you know what? With this injunction, the Schuberts can't buy anything. I can buy things. And he starts buying up all the theaters on Broadway that the Schuberts can't buy. And he buys the Alvin Theater, and the two guys, I've forgotten their name, but they're in jail. And Jimmy told me, he said, I used to have to, call them up in jail and give them the grosses from the theater because they were still part owners. So Jimmy slowly puts together his empire. And Bernie Jacobs and Jerry Schoenfeld are watching this guy assemble an empire because they can't do it because there's an injunction against the Schuberts from buying theaters. They don't think much of him. They don't have a lot of respect for him. And they have the chorus line, right? So they're sitting on top of the world. But Jimmy gets one show that the Schuberts never had a chance at because Charles Strauss and Martin Charnin, Tom Meehan, they wrote the show based on the old comic strip called Annie.
Right.
And they did it up at good speed. And it was not a hit. It wasn't very good. But I think it was Charlie Strauss who invited Mike Nichols up to see it. And Mike thought, show's not good, but there's a character that you could develop that could be good. The throwaway character called Miss Hannigan. If you bring more of her in there, then you've got a villain to oppose Annie and Daddy Warbucks. And that's going to make it more interesting. And so I can't remember the guy, some guy in Washington who was partners with Jimmy. He looked at the script and said, Jimmy, you want to do this with me? And Jimmy, well, who's involved? Well, Mike Nichols is there. Mike Nichols? Whatever, Mike Nichols, I'll do it. So Jimmy put $750,000 into Annie, which he had never seen and never heard, but because he liked Mike Nichols. Same thing though with Bernie Jacobs. Bernie Jacobs bet on Michael Bennett to do things, right? You can't pick the shows, but you can't pick the horses, but you can pick the jockeys who know who the good horses are.
Yeah.
You bet on a Michael Bennett because he's going to come up with something sooner or later. And Jimmy understood Mike Nichols. If he likes this thing, why should I not be in it? So Jimmy,
Right.
I guess, $750,000 per annum. It became as big as the chorus line was.
Right.
Solidified Jimmy's standing in the theater community. And I think the movie sale was unheard of at the time, something like $5 million, which they would be like $200 million. And
Yeah.
Jimmy had most of it all. And that's when the Schuberts thought, oh my God, this Detroit is now a competitor. And that great duel, as the New York Times called it, began between the Schuberts and the Nederlanders.
Right. Wow. And that's towards the end of the 70s. And so those two, talk to me a little bit about the cleanup of Times Square in the 70s, which involved, Jerry Schoenfeld really took a leadership position in that. And Broadway actors took part in the I Love New York campaign.
Yep.
Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, the cleanup took a long time. I mean, Jerry, God love him. Jerry, Bernie didn't give a shit about Times Square. He was like, he would step over a homeless person to get to a Michael Bennett show. But Jerry took on his responsibility running the Schuberts. He had a fundamental understanding that we live in this neighborhood. Our business is dependent on this neighborhood. And if this neighborhood continues to fall apart, our business will die too. So we got to fix this neighborhood. So Jerry was banging on and on against this neighborhood. He would go to Ed Koch back in the 80s. And Ed Koch said to him, Jerry, what's Broadway going to do? Move to New Jersey? I don't care. I got other battles to fight. But bit by bit, they would try to clean things up. And over time, Jerry understood fundamentally that you had to feel safe to go to a Broadway show.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because if you don't feel safe, you're not going to go. It's like right now, coronavirus. Nobody's going to feel safe going to a Broadway show right now. They're going to be afraid they'll get something. You have to, back then it was crime. You have to make them feel safe. So Jerry worked with the city and the police commissioners. And one of the innovative things that they did, it's kind of a small thing, but it meant something. They put policemen on horses. If you're in Times Square back, when it was open, now it's dead, but there are policemen on mounted horses. Now, why would you put a policeman on a horse? He can't gallop and get the mugger. He's not, hi-o silver and away we go.
Right.
Thing. If you're a theater goer and you go into a theater and you see some policeman on a horse, they're looking out for you.
Yeah.
They make you feel safe because they're looking around. And then Bill Bratton, the police commissioner, told me they also, they could also look around and they could see a mugging happening because they were above everybody else on a horse. Mm-hmm. And they could then call into the precinct and say, something's going on here on 8th Avenue and 46th Street, get over here. And then the police would come. But just little things like that made people feel a little bit safer. If you walk in 1977, 78, when Times Square was really seedy, you walk and you see a policeman on a horse looking around, he's looking out for you, you feel a little better. Simple things like that can turn things around.
That's pretty crazy because the policeman on the horses feels like such a staple now that we just see in New York, and to think that that's the reason why it became that in the first place is pretty wild.
Yeah, just little things like that. I remember I had a good friend, Sid Baumgarten. I think he's still with us. I interviewed him for the book. He was part of Mayor Beam's cleaning up task force of time. Sid was a tough lawyer, a very tough lawyer. Good law enforcement guy. Was a Marine, like a bulldog. And he would say, you know what? When I was charged with trying to clean up Times Square, you couldn't close down the dirty bookstores or the porn houses because the First Amendment allows you to sell whatever kind of books you want, to show whatever movies you kind of want. And Sid said, here's the problem, though. If you're going to sell, dirty books and show dirty movies, you're going to get bad characters. So how do you stop that without violating the First Amendment? So Sid had decided, he said, you know what? The people who run those places, who run the dirty bookstores, who run the dirty movies, they're criminals because they were basically, run by the mob back in those days. So they're probably doing some criminal activity that we should look into. As it turned out, those dirty bookstores, they were not paying their Con Ed bills because they had electricians wire their dirty bookstores up to the restaurant that was next door. So they were selling the electricity from the legitimate store next door.
There's the crime there.
Right. So Sid sent in the guys to close them down and said, First Amendment right to sell dirty books, but you can't steal the electricity from nothing. Close you down. So then those guys with the dirty bookstores, they would light candles to keep the store going. And Sid said, okay, well, send the fire department in. You can't have open candles in a store. It's a fire hazard. Close them down. He found all these unique ways just to keep those mobsters who ran all that sleaze back then out of business.
That's so smart. That's so clever.
Yeah.
And then New York was, and now we have the Times Square that we know today, which is...
Well, sadly, the Times Square we know today, Chloe, it's a very sad state of affairs. I mean, I meet my friend Imogen Lloyd Webber up there for a drink just to salute old times. We sit under the marquee of the Phantom of the Opera. Her dad's show is now closed. And everything in New York is kind of bustling now. The West Village is busy and bustling. And where I live here, you can go out and have dinner anytime. Upper East Side, where my girlfriend lives, is bustling and outdoor activity, and everyone's drinking and having a good time. The one place that is not is Times Square. It is still dead because without tourists, without shows, there is nothing there anymore.
But they will be back. They will be back.
Well, we shall see.
And we're going to be so happy when they are.
It's going to take some time. I mean, I think it's going to take a vaccine for people to feel safe to go back there, but
it'll happen.
Man, well, you can be optimistic. I'm not as optimistic as you are. Because remember, the longer it goes on, the harder it is to come back.
I think your book proves that Broadway is resilient.
Yes, it is. I mean, in my new book, Singular Sensation, The Battle for Broadway, Singular Sensation, The Triumph of Broadway, allow me to give a plug for the book. It's got a card from Publishers Weekly, and it's about Broadway in the 90s and just showing how things shifted. Andrew Lloyd Webber, he was the top guy back then. He had Sunset Boulevard, the biggest show of all. And yet, everything shifted and changed. Sunset Boulevard was not the big hit it was supposed to be, and it kind of collapsed. And the show that replaced it was a show written by someone no one ever heard of that cost 2 cents, called Rent. But it was American, and it was contemporary. And that was the launching pad for Broadway's triumph, its resiliency in the 1990s. And then I take the book up to September 11th. I'll never forget that day. I live here in the West Village. I used to, before all these rich people built these fancy towers behind me, I had a view of the World Trade Center, and I was having my cup of coffee, and all of a sudden I saw this gash in the North Tower of the world. What is going on here? Why is there this big black mark across the North Tower? And then the world fell apart. I remember calling Jerry Schoenfeld, and I said, Jerry, what are we going to do? He said, Michael, I don't know. But Broadway rallied then. And in my new book, Singular Sensation, I tell the story of how Broadway rallied and saved itself and became an emblem of the strength of New York City.
Absolutely.
Whether this can happen now, I mean, I don't know. I mean, a virus is not a terrorist. A virus is something that we don't know about. It's out there. It's here. It's there. How do you fight it? I don't know. But Broadway is in a lot of trouble, I think.
It is, but we're all working to bring it back stronger than ever.
The only good, there's no good thing about this. The only thing that might pave the way for Broadway's recovery is I frankly thought Broadway got too fat and too rich, charging these obscene prices, $1,200 a ticket, premium prices. It made it inaccessible to, kids like me when I came to New York and didn't have any money, right? Afford to see Hamilton if I were a kid. Well, that's going to end. And Broadway has to figure out a way to come back where it makes the economics make sense so the people who love the theater can afford to go to the theater.
Right. Absolutely.
Broadway priced itself out of the marketplace. It was like, we want to take as much money as we can get, and we don't care about you people who can't pay $850 for a seat. That is going to change. And that's not a bad thing.
No, that is not a bad thing. Well, on that note, that's all of our time for today. So I really appreciate you taking part in this, in another book club discussion, and we will see you for next time.